A PBY Catalina flying boat disappeared during a routine patrol over the Dutch East Indies, taking 6 airmen into the unknown. When divers finally descended into a volcanic crater lake, they found the aircraft sitting upright in crystal clear water, perfectly preserved after 78 years. Inside the cockpit, dog tags and personal letters waited in darkness. 3 families had spent decades wondering where their sons went down. The answer was resting 200 feet beneath a lake that locals had fished for generations. March 15, 1945. 6 young airmen climbed aboard their PBY Catalina flying boat at a military base in the Dutch East Indies. The war in the Pacific was winding down, but reconnaissance missions remained critical. Japanese forces still occupied scattered islands, and Allied commanders needed eyes in the sky to track enemy movements. The crew was experienced. Pilot Lieutenant James Morrison, 24 years old, had flown dozens of missions over hostile territory. Co-pilot Sergeant Robert Chen, 22, was on his 15th patrol. Radio operator Corporal Michael O'Brien, just 19, had joined the crew 3 months earlier. Flight engineer Staff Sergeant David Williams, 26, was the veteran of the group. Gunners Private First Class Anthony Rossi, 20, and Private Tommy Nakamura, 18, completed the team. The PBY Catalina was perfectly suited for long-range reconnaissance. The amphibious aircraft could take off from water or land, fly for over 2,000 miles, and stay airborne for more than 12 hours. Its twin engines and sturdy construction had earned it the nickname, the flying boat that won the war. The aircraft could land on rough seas to rescue downed pilots or conduct covert operations behind enemy lines. Their mission briefing was routine: fly north along the Indonesian archipelago, photograph Japanese installations on several islands, monitor shipping activity, and return to base. Expected flight time, 8 hours. Weather conditions, favorable. Enemy activity, minimal. At 0630 hours, the Catalina lifted off from the water and disappeared into the morning haze. The crew was scheduled to make radio contact every 2 hours. The first check-in came on schedule at 0830. Morrison reported clear skies and no enemy contact. The second check-in at 10:30 confirmed they were on course, approaching the target area. At 12:30 hours, silence. The base radio operator tried repeatedly to raise the aircraft. Nothing. By 1400 hours, the Catalina was officially overdue. Search aircraft were scrambled immediately. They flew the planned route, scanning the ocean for wreckage, oil slicks, or life rafts. They found nothing. The search continued for 2 weeks. Aircraft from multiple bases joined the effort. Ships diverted from their routes to scan the water. The area was methodically covered and recovered. Not a trace of the missing Catalina was found. On March 30th, 1945, the 6 crew members were officially declared missing in action. Their families received telegrams with the standard military language. The wording was clinical, but the message was devastating. Your son, your husband, your brother had vanished somewhere over the Pacific. No wreckage had been found. No bodies had been recovered. There was no grave to visit, no closure to find. Margaret Morrison received the telegram about her son James while she was hanging laundry in her backyard in Ohio. She read it twice before the words registered. Missing in action, presumed dead. She would spend the next 78 years wondering where her boy had gone down. Robert Chen's parents in California held a memorial service without a body. His younger sister kept his bedroom exactly as he had left it, waiting for news that never came. She would check the mailbox every day for months, hoping for word from the military that he had been found. Michael O'Brien's mother in Boston wrote letters to the War Department for decades, requesting any new information about her son's fate. The responses were always the same. No new evidence had been discovered. The case remained open, but inactive. The families formed an informal network, writing to each other, sharing any rumors or leads they heard about missing aircraft discoveries. They attended reunions of the squadron, hoping to meet someone who might have information. They never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would learn what happened to their loved ones. As the years passed, the families aged. Parents died without ever knowing where their sons rested. Siblings grew old carrying questions that had no answers. Children grew up hearing stories about uncles they had never met, men who had vanished into the Pacific and never returned. By the 1990s, most of the immediate family members were gone. The search for answers passed to a new generation. Nieces and nephews, grandchildren, who had never met the missing airmen but felt connected to their stories. They used the internet to research military records, contacted veteran organizations, and followed up on any reports of aircraft discoveries in the Pacific. The official military position never changed. The PBY Catalina and its crew were lost somewhere over the ocean. The exact location was unknown, and would likely remain so. The Pacific was vast, the water deep, and the chances of ever finding the wreckage were essentially zero. Lake Toba in North Sumatra, Indonesia, is one of the largest volcanic crater lakes in the world. Formed by a massive eruption 74,000 years ago, the lake stretches 60 miles long and 20 miles wide. Its maximum depth exceeds 1,600 feet. The water is remarkably clear, fed by mountain springs and rainfall. Local Batak fishermen have worked these waters for generations. They know every current, every seasonal change, every underwater formation that affects their nets. In the 1950s, some began reporting something unusual in the deepest part of the lake. There was a shadow, explained Toba Siahan, whose grandfather had been among the first to notice it. Not rocks, not a ridge. Something with straight edges, too regular to be natural. It was massive, maybe 100 feet long. The fishermen developed theories. Some believed it was a sunken boat from the colonial era. Others thought it might be debris from the volcanic eruption that created the lake. A few suggested it could be a Japanese aircraft that had crashed during the war, but that seemed unlikely. Lake Toba was far from any known flight paths. The shadow became part of local folklore. Fishermen would point it out to their sons, warning them to avoid the area during storms when the currents were unpredictable. Some claim the shadow moved slightly over the years, shifting position as sediment accumulated around it. In the 1980s, recreational diving began developing in Indonesia. A few adventurous divers explored the shallower areas of Lake Toba, but the depth where the shadow rested was beyond the reach of sport divers. The water was too deep, too cold, and too remote from diving facilities. By the 2000s, stories about the shadow had spread beyond the local fishing community. Indonesian researchers heard the reports and became curious. What could be large enough to create such a distinct sonar signature? What could have ended up in the middle of a crater lake? Dr. Sari Dwi, a marine archaeologist at the University of Indonesia, first heard about the Lake Toba shadow in 2018. She was researching World War II aircraft losses in the region and had compiled a database of missing planes. When she plotted the locations on a map, she noticed something interesting. Several aircraft had vanished in the general area of North Sumatra. Most were assumed to have crashed in the ocean or jungle, but the search records were incomplete. The chaos of wartime had left many cases poorly documented. It was possible, she realized, that some aircraft had made it further inland than anyone had assumed. Dr. Dewey applied for a research grant to investigate the Lake Toba anomaly. She assembled a team of technical divers and underwater archaeologists. In 2022, they received permission from Indonesian authorities to conduct a scientific expedition to the lake. The research vessel anchored above the coordinates, where fishermen had consistently reported the shadow. Side-scan sonar confirmed a large object on the lake bottom 200 feet down. The shape was artificial, definitely not geological. It appeared to be intact, sitting upright on the sediment. Technical diver Captain Andy Wijaya was the first to descend. He had explored dozens of shipwrecks in Indonesian waters, but Lake Toba presented unique challenges. The fresh water was colder than the ocean. The depth required careful decompression planning. Most importantly, if this was an aircraft, it was also a war grave. At 150 feet, Wijaya's lights began illuminating the lake bottom. The water was remarkably clear, clearer than most ocean sites he had explored. At 180 feet, shapes began emerging from the darkness. At 200 feet, he found himself face to face with something extraordinary. A PBY Catalina flying boat sat upright on the lake bottom, perfectly preserved. The aircraft appeared almost new, as if it had been gently placed on the sediment rather than crashed. The hull was intact. The wings were in position. The engines showed no obvious damage. Wijaya circled the aircraft slowly, documenting everything with his camera. The registration numbers on the fuselage were clearly visible. The gun turrets were in their normal positions. Hatches were closed. This was not the wreckage of a violent crash. This was an aircraft that had somehow made a controlled landing on the lake's surface and then sunk intact. The preservation was unprecedented. In salt water, metal corrodes rapidly. In the cold, fresh water of Lake Toba, the aluminum and steel had barely deteriorated. Paint was still visible on some surfaces. Rubber seals around windows remained flexible. The aircraft looked like it could be raised and restored to flying condition. But WWII's most significant discovery came when he peered through the cockpit windows. Inside, he could see the silhouettes of crew members still at their stations. After 78 years underwater, the men who had vanished in 1945 were exactly where they had been when the aircraft sank. The interior of the Catalina was a time capsule from 1945. The cold, fresh water had created perfect preservation conditions. Organic materials that would have decomposed in months in salt water remained intact after nearly 8 decades. Dr. Dewey's team spent weeks documenting the aircraft before attempting any recovery operations. Every surface was photographed. Every artifact was cataloged. The site was treated with the reverence due to a war grave. The crew members were found at their duty stations. The pilot and co-pilot were in the cockpit, still strapped into their seats. The radio operator was at his equipment. The flight engineer was near the engine controls. The gunners were in their positions. None showed signs of trauma or panic. They appeared to have remained at their posts as the aircraft settled onto the lake surface and gradually sank. Personal effects were scattered throughout the cabin. Letters from home, still legible after 78 years underwater. Photographs of families, preserved in waterproof cases. A harmonica in the radio operator's kit. A St. Christopher medal around the pilot's neck. These intimate details brought the crew back to life in ways that military records never could. The most important discoveries were the identification tags. Each crew member wore dog tags with their name, serial number, and next of kin information. After 78 years of uncertainty, the families finally had definitive proof of what had happened to their loved ones. But the dog tags also raised new questions. How had a PBY Catalina flying a reconnaissance mission over the ocean ended up in a crater lake 200 miles inland? The aircraft showed no signs of combat damage. The crew appeared to have survived the initial landing. What had brought them to Lake Toba? The answer lay in the aircraft's logbook, preserved in a waterproof case in the cockpit. The final entries, written in Lieutenant Morrison's handwriting, told a story that no one had imagined. According to the logbook, the reconnaissance mission had proceeded normally until 1200 hours. The crew had photographed their assigned targets and was beginning the return flight when they encountered unexpected weather. A tropical storm system had developed rapidly, creating dangerous flying conditions. Morrison made the decision to divert inland, seeking calmer air away from the ocean. This was standard procedure for aircraft caught in severe weather. The PBY Catalina was designed to handle rough conditions, but tropical storms could be deadly for any aircraft. The diversion took them over the mountains of North Sumatra. As they climbed to clear the peaks, the aircraft began experiencing engine problems. The logbook entries became increasingly urgent. Oil pressure dropping, engine temperature rising. They were losing power. Morrison spotted Lake Toba through a break in the clouds. The massive crater lake offered the only possible landing site in the mountainous terrain. He made the decision to attempt a water landing, something the PBY Catalina was specifically designed to do. The landing was successful. The aircraft touched down on the lake surface and remained afloat. The crew was uninjured. They had survived the emergency landing and were safe on the water. Morrison's final logbook entry was optimistic. Successful emergency landing on large lake, aircraft intact, crew safe. Will attempt repairs and takeoff when weather clears. But the PBY Catalina was not designed for extended operations on fresh water. Salt water provides more buoyancy than fresh water. The aircraft began settling lower as water seeped through small gaps in the hull seals. What had started as a successful emergency landing gradually became a sinking. The crew had time to prepare. They gathered their personal effects. They secured the aircraft's classified materials. They wrote final letters to their families, letters that would be found 78 years later, still sealed in waterproof containers. As the aircraft settled deeper into the water, the crew made a collective decision. They would remain at their stations. They would go down with their aircraft, maintaining military discipline to the end. It was a choice that reflected their training, their dedication, and their understanding of duty. The PBY Catalina sank slowly in the deep, clear water of Lake Toba. The crew remained at their posts as the lake closed over them. They had survived the emergency landing, but they could not survive the isolation. No rescue was possible. No one knew where they were. Dr. Dewey's team worked with military historians to match the dog tags with personnel records. The process took months, but eventually, every crew member was positively identified. Lieutenant James Morrison, Sergeant Robert Chen, Corporal Michael O'Brien, Staff Sergeant David Williams, Private First Class Anthony Rossi, and Private Tommy Nakamura. The families were contacted through military channels. After 78 years of uncertainty, they finally had answers. Their loved ones had not died in combat. They had not been shot down by enemy aircraft. They had survived an emergency landing, but succumbed to circumstances beyond their control. Margaret Morrison's granddaughter, Sarah, received the call about her grandfather. She had grown up hearing stories about the uncle who had vanished in the war. Now, at age 45, she was learning that his remains had been found in a crater lake in Indonesia. It was overwhelming, Sarah recalled. We had always wondered, always hoped that someday we might know what happened to him. To learn that he had survived the landing, that he had written final letters to his family, it was both heartbreaking and comforting.